Hey, y'all, and welcome back to the Playmakers Corner podcast. I'm your host for this episode, Cody Stoffer, and we got season previews today. Today, we'll be talking about a handful of 3A teams and then mostly 2A teams from one specific league here. So I'm excited to talk about all these squads and what they were able to accomplish last year. Some of the seniors from that class of 2023 that made it possible for them to find that success. And then, moving forward from there, just talking about the teams that, and what they will be able to do this season with some of the players that are making a return. So, should be a pretty good group here talking about, these 3A teams that included a title winner from last season and then a 2A conference that fielded a couple of playoff teams. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. So, with this very first team, we're going to be talking about the Mountain View Mountain Lions there. It's a mouthful, and, they were honestly a doormat for the most part, excluding one blowout win over Centaurus, but surprisingly pushed Northridge in a close loss, 9-7, and narrowly lost to Riverdale to start the season, but had one of the more brutal schedules in all of 3A, playing, 4A state runner-up Loveland, then playing a top 3A team in Green Mountain, playing another playoff team in Holy Family. That was all non-league play. And then Northridge, Thompson Valley, Res Christian, Severance, and Roosevelt all being in the exact same league. So some of the guys that helped, this team win that game and push Northridge and push Riverdale to start the season, as well as, kind of put up a decent fight, I would say, against Severance, included Alex Blanco, who was second on the team with 47 tackles, 2 of those being for loss. Braden Hutchinson had 6 tackles for loss and was third in total tackles with 2 forced fumbles to boot with that. Lucas Frecking was on the defensive line with 2 tackles for loss. Xavion Aragon had an interception and 3 pass deflections, and overall the class of 2023 leaves with 75% of all tackles for loss from this past season. What are some of the players that can try and remedy that? Well, you have guys like Anthony Herrera, who led the team in tackles at 52, while also forcing a turnover via interception. Cooper Lubiani was a monster defending the pass with an absurd 15 pass breakups and 4 interceptions that complemented, his lower tackle numbers. But, honestly, just an absolute beast through the air and a very, very hard player to try and complete passes against. You also have a trio of sophomores in Trent Lawson, Casey Mendoza, and Keegan Amons, who combined for 88 tackles, with Lawson and Mendoza both having a pair of interceptions per person and recording 7 total pass deflections between the two of them. Meanwhile, Amons was more impactful in the front 7, with the team's second best 3 tackles for loss of his 28 tackles. And then of those 28 total tackles, 19 of them were solo tackles. Isaac Morales was the leading receiver on this team, catching 24 passes for 415 yards and 3 scores, which all led the team per category. Derek Parker was only a sophomore, but was the only other receiver in the triple digits with 210 receiving yards and a score. Tyler Klusman was the lead tailback with 50 carries, just narrowly having more than Amons, but the duo combined for 3 scores and just under 400 yards. And then the offense will come and go with Bergen Roth, who as a junior could have been worse. His ability to run the football, for 6 scores helped offset his interception totals for sure. But looking ahead to this Mountain View schedule here, I think that there's a lot of things that you could be excited about. I think that Riverdale Ridge, I think that Mountain View has a little bit more consistency than Riverdale Ridge and should probably win that game this time around, considering that they only lost by 1 last season. Then they have Loveland on the road. Loveland did graduate a pretty substantial amount of players. However, I think I'm still going to err on the side of Loveland here. Green Mountain was maybe the most senior-heavy team in all of 3A last year for their success. So, I think that Mountain View definitely has a chance here, especially considering that it's at home. Holy Family, I think that Holy Family has more quality varsity experience for their returning players than Mountain View, so I'm going to give that one to Holy Family. Centaurus, I mean, they beat the brakes off of them last year with a lot of the same guys. Centaurus is returning a lot of the same guys as well, but considering how not close that was, might have to give it to Mountain View. Mountain View might also beat Northridge here, considering the contributors that graduated from Northridge was just a lot, honestly. So I think I'm going to give this one to Mountain View. Thompson Valley, I think that once again, Thompson Valley just had a bit more quality experience. It's going to be returning to the fold here. Same with potentially Resurrection Christian, Severance for sure, and probably Roosevelt. So I think that they still probably don't have a winning record in league, but I think that they actually win a game in league here. And I'd say that, in their non-league games, they should probably win 2 of those, honestly. Or, I'll say 1, actually, and then give Mountain View a window of wins of 2 to 4 here, just with all the returning weapons that they have on offense and the, very turnover-friendly defense that they were able to create against the pass. I know a lot of these teams are obviously run-first teams, but, I think that if Mountain View can get up a lead, early and force other teams to pass, that plays right into their strength as a defense. And, they can make a pretty substantial difference here in, getting turnovers and, winning football games with short fields. So Mountain View, window of wins, 2 to 4. I'll probably lean more on the 3-7 final record. And speaking of Northridge, next up we do have the Grizz here, who, had a very heavy senior class that spelled title ambitions as they opened up the season at home with a very narrow win over Evergreen before dominating the rest of Greeley and concluding non-league play with a 50-burger shutout over a 5A squad in Rangeview. Entering league play, they appeared more susceptible, barely beating Mountain View, getting rocked by Roosevelt, and then scraping by Thompson Valley before handling their business against first-year 3A teams in Resurrection Christian and Severance, before probably the biggest upset of the postseason of any classification, losing to Palisade at home and ending their season. Now, that obviously was a pretty big disappointment for this Northridge squad, but there was a lot to be happy about and a lot for these seniors to leave proud about in this overall 9-2 season. I'd say that one of the players that, has kind of been, I'll say, a mainstay more or less, was Cooper Rose, who was the starter at quarterback and provided stability for this offense. Nothing spectacular or crazy, and was probably the biggest inhibitor of this team's championships aspirations, but nonetheless, could complete passes and allow them to kind of open it up sometimes and change up their look, depending on the matchup and the opposing team. Isaac Ness and David West's presence will be greatly missed, as they were able to effectively split carries and combine for 1,500 yards and 21 scores while keeping enough gas in the tank to contribute on defense from time to time. West was a solid member of the pass defense with 2 interceptions and also notched 27 tackles. Ness's tackle numbers were a little lower, but he was still an impact player with 2 picks and a fumble recovery while forcing one as well. In the pass game, this team had 5 receivers that were all seniors and is not returning a single one of the 14 receiving touchdowns they had last year, most notably Reese Pratt's that led in all receiving stats, and yes, I mean all receptions, yards, average, touchdowns, all the goods there. So, Reese is graduating as well as the other top 4 receivers below him. Parker Steckel is a huge loss for this team on both sides of the ball, leading the team in tackles with 82 and also tackles for loss with 9 of his own, and then defensively getting 2 interceptions and a forced fumble to pair with a fumble recovery and a team-high 4 sacks. All of this, keep in mind, he did all of this on the defensive end, literally making plays in every single possible way that you could ask from a linebacker, and then was paving lanes on the offensive line for one of the most balanced rushing attacks in the state. Next to him on that line was Cody Burkholder. I believe he was at center, who is, just in general, one of the best offensive linemen in 3A. And then he combined that by being a dominant 2-way force, 6 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, which were both good for second best on the squad here. And he did that at more of a defensive line position. Dylan Hubbard was another 6 tackle for loss dude on the Grizz and recorded 2, fumble recoveries as well. Jace Reed for Northridge accounted for 3 total turnovers after recording 2 fumble recoveries and a pick. Brendan Peterson was not in the backfield as much, but was important in finishing tackles with 57 total tackles and accounting for 39 assists, and would not be left out of the forcing turnover party with 4 interceptions and a fumble recovery. Jackson Jenkins was the only player to force multiple fumbles, but was also third on the team with 5 tackles for loss. The leader in turnovers was none other than Jaden Marquez, who recorded an insane 8 interceptions and was one of the leaders in the entire state across all classifications from his cornerback position, as a guy who is able to play both slot corner as well as outside corner, even at a smaller stature, using great timing, verticality, and IQ to break up a lot of passes or to jump a lot of passes as well when in those zone situations. Chris Thrill is another member of this offensive line that I'm pretty sure graduates all of their starters, leaving more questions than answers looking to next season. So, just for an umbrella recap of the graduating class, Northridge loses 35 tackles for loss, their top 10 tacklers, which adds up to over 400 tackles, 92% of their sacks, 21 interceptions, 13 fumble recoveries on defense, and the big woof here is 40 total touchdowns graduate across the stage from this past year. So obviously one of their best years, probably in program history, definitely in recent memory, and everything that you could potentially hope for being a quote-unquote contender. Now, they are having some guys back this next season, not a lot, so this part of the segment here is going to be a bit shorter before we look at their schedule here this fall. But, we got to talk about the only junior or senior to score, which was Raul Gallegos on a rushing touchdown. He was also the leading tackler that wasn't a senior with 26 total tackles and 3 for loss. Dylan Phipps was only a sophomore, contributing 32 points on kicks, and maybe even more important this season where red zone trips will be harder to come by. After hitting along a 40, maybe he can extend his range and give this Grizzly team more opportunities to score. Braden Asmus recorded 2 interceptions as a junior last year. And then Caden Brink was the only other non-senior with a turnover by getting an interception and recovering a fumble. So still having a few interceptions returning, but more questions than answers here. They open up the season against Gateway. Gateway, who forfeit last year, and they kind of only have 2 impact players, but might be enough to beat Northridge. I'm not even sure, just because of all the uncertainty, that you have to consider. So, but Northridge, they beat them pretty thoroughly last year. So, Evergreen on the road. Both of these teams are graduating a ton of talent, but this team, this squad here, will be on the road. So I'm gonna just probably give it to Evergreen. Greeley Central and Greeley West, for as great as Northridge has been, these other 2 programs in the years that have led up to Northridge's really coming out party with the 9-1 season, these other 2 programs have struggled mightily, but they do return way more seniors that saw varsity snaps than Northridge. It just comes down to what is the functionality or dysfunctionality of each of these individual programs here. So it's really hard to favor the Central and West side when Northridge has just been so consistent. So, maybe they split these games or maybe they just win them both. Rangeview, this one is on the road. I don't think that they'll be putting up a 50-point blowout shutout win. It's a winnable game, but just not quite in the same way as last season, I don't think. Mountain View would be next. I honestly don't think that they win this game, just looking at the rosters, if I'm being 100 with everyone. And then Roosevelt, they don't win that game. I don't think that they beat Thompson Valley this year. Res Christian, that's a little bit of a toss-up. And then Severance, they probably lose that game. So, I think that this is going to be a huge step back for Northridge, just because of the amount of seniors that were getting substantial snaps last year is kind of hard to fathom. I think that, they could win Honestly, at most, I I have a hard time thinking that they could win 6 games. So I might just say like 5 and say that they could potentially go 5-5. Feel free to prove me wrong, of course. But I think at best this team goes 5-5. At worst, they still should probably win 2 of these games here, just based off of not even really them, but maybe like the absurdly bad reputation of the other programs. So Northridge Grizzlies, window of wins, 2-5. Great fall 2022 season, highly aided by a ton of seniors. Up next on this 3A docket here is Thompson Valley out of Loveland. So we talked about Mountain View. Obviously, we talked about Loveland on the 4A level. And so this is going to conclude our Loveland teams here. And, with a winning record in league last season, as well as a solid performance on the home turf, Thompson Valley actually punched a ticket to the playoffs and lost in a thriller to Evergreen in the very first round. So, honestly, I'd say a lot to be happy about for this Thompson Valley team that does graduate some contributors, but also returns an interesting batch of other players. This team was fairly young, to be fair, but, was spearheaded by Tucker McGinnis, who made second team All-State and will continue to play ball at Chadron State this year, but was definitely a tone setter for this squad, playing with a violence on both sides of the football in, the line spot that just really wasn't matched or met by any other players. Aiden Gray was another all-state kind of guy after tying for the team lead in tackles with 92, along with fellow senior Roman Bittner. The fourth highest tackler on the squad was Isaac Miller, who was tied for the team lead in tackles for loss at 2 and was the only senior with an interception while also recovering a fumble. Owen Schutz boasted 2 sacks and 2 tackles for loss this season, and Caden Newmiller had 2 receiving touchdowns and over 100 receiving yards. While, in general, the top 4 tacklers all graduate and take 282 tackles with them for just a hair over 50% of the total of tackles. But, I'd say that part of the overachievement for this squad, looking at the returning playmakers, was how well this young offense navigated the season. Since juniors Riley Suarez and Marco Lapierre had a special connection, with Suarez finding Lapierre 33 times for 572 yards and a high of 6 touchdowns. But that didn't mean that Riley didn't find anybody else who was open, like sophomore Garrett Hendrickson, 31 catches, 411 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And then on defense, Hendrickson also led the Eagles with 2 interceptions and recovered a fumble, was the only underclassman with over 40 tackles. Christian Chase had 10 rushing scores and 710 yards and was very nicely complemented by junior tailback Jack Mackay, who had himself 7 scores on 100 carries for 432 yards, providing balance both to this offense and the backfield. Doing his part to be balanced was Suarez, who not only threw for 1,354 yards, but ran for another 307 and was responsible for 16 total touchdowns. Atreyu May was only a freshman with limited targets, but should see an uptick in playmaking after scoring on a 55-yard touchdown last season. Dane Gray was another sophomore with 38 tackles and is a part of 8 out of 13 returning tacklers. The majority of those, obviously, are the playmakers who, were at the top. So lots of those depth guys getting a chance to step up and contribute sooner rather than later here. So let's go ahead and talk about their matchups here. They open up at home against Summit. I think that this is a winnable football game. It's one that they only lost by 6 last year to a team that, was very senior heavy. So I think that Thompson Valley should take this one. Then they have Berthoud on the road. This was a 2A squad last year that was solid in some aspects, but I definitely think this is a game that Thompson Valley should win. Then they have Loveland at home. This is actually probably their best chance to beat the 4A Loveland squad that they've had in at least since we have been covering Colorado football. But, Loveland, they do a great job of restocking. They have some dudes that are returning. So it will be a tall task, but possible. Riverdale Ridge, Niwot, both games they should win. Severance, this is a really interesting one. Severance graduating some very good defensive talent, but then also bringing back some top-notch talent on the offensive side of the football. Mountain View, this game, once again, another Loveland matchup, but I think Thompson Valley just has more quality varsity experience. I think that Thompson Valley should probably beat Northridge this year. I don't know if they beat Roosevelt, and I'll have them favored against Res Christian. So I only have this Eagles squad losing potentially 3 games. I think that they should be, maybe on the high end 8-2 and on the low end 6-4. So I'm going to say a window of wins of 6-8 for Thompson Valley here. And if I got to predict their exact record here, let's say they win. Let's say that they lose that one. Win, lose, win. We'll say 7-3. My exact record will be 7-3 for this team. But they do have to go through the defending state champs for 3A, the Roosevelt Roughriders, who had the best possible season that any team could possibly have, going completely undefeated en route to a state championship, and honestly going relatively uncontested throughout this season, winning by 17, then 41, then 49, then winning by 3 over 5A Highlands Ranch on the road, then 22, then 15, that's 29, that's a lot, that's 47, that's 30. It wasn't really until Lutheran in the championship game where they had to come back and win. So, Lane Wassinger, the coach there, and the Rough Riders finally get the monkey off their back and take home the hardware in an undefeated season with historical marks along the way. So let's talk about some of these historical figures for this Rough Rider squad that includes the most storied wide receiver in Colorado football history with multiple state appearances, playoff appearances, and led in all-time touchdowns with 51 and was the CHSAA Player of the Year to go with his state ring, where he also popped off in the title game, which is none other than Tucker Peterson. As mentioned just now, he is the all-time leading receiver in touchdown catches with 51, and it's crazy that this happens during A, on a 3A squad, and B, including a pandemic year. Catching for almost 3,000 total yards over the course of his career, and only not catching double-digit touchdowns during his sophomore year, which was the COVID season. So, absolute stud, absolute beast. Also, great two-way player making plays on the defensive side of the football, getting an interception in that state championship game, which was huge out of the 5 that he had all year. Overall, 11 picks over the course of his career, 14 pass deflections, 82 tackles, 13 of them for loss, especially his junior year where he really popped off and had some sacks as well. So Tucker Peterson, honestly, the GOAT in Roosevelt history and one of the GOAT wide receivers in Colorado football history, period. He does graduate and, I believe is playing on the next level at Chadron, if I'm not mistaken. But he's a D1 talent for sure. They were also spoiled in the fact that Ryan Doucette was the RB2 and would be the starter on basically any other team in the state. He recorded 123 carries for 1,117 yards and 13 scores while also tying for Tucker with the most interceptions this season. The next 3 receivers after Tucker were also all seniors, with Bowie Schmitz spearheading that trio with 395 yards and, of the group's 700 plus yards and the other 7 receiving touchdowns that this group was responsible for. Isaiah Paccio was the only player with multiple interceptions recording for his senior season, but also leading the team in pass deflections with 6, and multiple outside of Doucette and Tucker. Then you have Ryan Knutson, who is the leading tackler on the squad with 83 total tackles and finding himself disrupting the backfield 19 times. And then if you add on a team third best 5 sacks, that is a season of a defensive game wrecker. Much like this other senior, Elazar Valencia, who is the primary backfield resident, recording an absurd 15.5 sacks and pressuring the QB 11 additional times while leading the team in tackles for loss with 33 of his 78 total tackles. If this guy was tackling last season, it was going down in the backfield. Evan Klein was third on the team in tackles with 71, 11 of which were in the backfield. Anthony Munoz has been seeing playing time since his freshman year, and it concluded with a 55 tackle and 9 tackle for loss season, where he'd also go in at guard and be a punishing aspect of the Roughriders ground game. Miguel Hernandez was another senior along with Andrew Lara, both who had double-digit tackles for loss, combining for 23 and 116 total tackles between the two of them. And this historic defense graduates 651 tackles, 109 tackles for loss, which is 80% of the total, 33 of 43 sacks, 16 of 17 interceptions, all 13 fumble recoveries, 23 forced fumbles, and all 3 field goal blocks, with 11 of their top 12 tacklers walking across the stage. Definitely not an ideal situation for Roosevelt here, but, one that they'll be able to weather nonetheless. But, I don't think that they're as hosed as some of the other teams in 3A here with some of the returning talent that they'll be bringing back. One of the big ones and one of the key spots to still be competitive is at the quarterback position. They returned Bronco Hartson, who patiently waited and learned a couple seasons ago and the season prior from his brother, and is going to be Roosevelt's first non-one-year starter in quite some time, and has momentum, playing defensive end in certain situations last year, but offensively was a menace, throwing for 1,721 yards with a ratio of 20 touchdowns to 9 picks and sprinkling in another 8 scores on the ground. He will have to try and replicate a lot of his game without the best receiver in 3A history, which will be an interesting challenge for Bronco. But he will be aided by one of the best players in state last year in Xavier Ramirez, who comes back after a 2,000-plus yard season where he ran for 30 touchdowns and over 100 yards in all but one contest all season long, using just phenomenal burst, strength, and stellar acceleration to turn 5-yard gains into 40-yard touchdowns on a regular basis. The line he had in front of him looks a little bit different this year, but his running style will still yield a big senior season and help this team, I believe, be a make for the postseason. And then on the defensive side of the ball, you had a freshman last year in Dylan Doyon who held his own with the big boys, being third on the team in tackles for loss with 17. And when you're graduating as many as Roosevelt, you need that one player who is returning to really be a stud, and Dylan is exactly that. So let's go ahead and take a look at their schedule coming up this season. Palisade, this game is going to be in Palisade, which is a little bit difficult, but I still think that Roosevelt is the more talented team. I would say the same for Kennedy. This Fort Morgan game should be a lot more interesting than it was last year, and it's in Fort Morgan, but I still want to give Roosevelt the edge here. Highlands Ranch themselves also graduates a ton of talent from last year, but, I don't know if Roosevelt is the same complete team, but I'm still going to give it to Roosevelt here. Holy Family, this is going to be a great, great, great football game. Holy Family returns a lot more seniors, but, Roosevelt returns the more dominant ones from last season. I'll say coin toss, but still have Roosevelt favored. Same with Res Christian and Northridge. I think that Severance and Thompson Valley probably have the best chances in league to beat Roosevelt, and, I think that they should beat Mountain View. So even despite the heavy graduating class, I still think that the most amount of games that this team could lose would be, I don't even know, about 5. So we'll say 5 for now. So we'll say on the low end, they win 5 games. And we'll say on the high end, they win 8. I think that there are still some challenges this year. And I think that this is going to be a team that's going to have to grow with some losses potentially to be a threat for state next season. So, Roosevelt here, we'll say 5 to 8 window of wins, but I do think that they are probably going to go 8-2 and be on the high end of that total and be a little bit closer to, one of the top seeds in 3A this year yet again. Now we officially move full tilt to 2A here, as I'm going to talk about the Aspen Skiers and, everything that went down revolving this program. So last year was a bumpy ride for the new look Skiers, who won 2 games, but, was fairly uncompetitive in most of their contests with just a lack of competent quarterback delivering the football. But, Looking at the amount of seniors that graduated, one of those was Nate Thomas, who was the quarterback who led with 652 passing yards, but also was the second best runner on the team in total yards, but was just too turnover prone. But on defense, he still managed to be second on the team in tackles for loss. You also got to look at Gertman, who I predicted to lead in receiving yards, and he was second on the squad with 259 yards and a score. And then Robbie McDade was one of the players who had 2 sacks and was third on the team with 29 tackles through 5 recorded games, and may have been even more impactful than that, to be honest. But the returning playmakers is what has to get you excited about this team here. So let's talk about them because, this was a very young team, as noticeable with 9 of their top 11 returning tacklers, being younger and, having 9 of those top 11 guys not be seniors, including rising junior Landon Thurber, who is listed as the leading tackler and was also one of just 2 players to notch an interception while recovering a fumble last season. Tanner Benson was the other player to force a turnover in pass defense and brings back 26 tackles as well. He was also the more effective out of the 2 passers last season, completing 53% to Thomas's 46% and at least matching his INT to TD numbers at 5 apiece, and could benefit from a more ground-centric system that the Skiers plan on rolling out this season that plays to his strength as the leading rusher on the squad. Roan Smith looks like one of the major dangers on this squad after leading the team with more tackles for loss than any other player combined and recovering a fumble. Henry Hurd had a meaningful sophomore season, recovering a fumble and recording one of the TFLs on this squad and finding the quarterback a couple of times through the season. When they do decide to pass, he will resume to be the best offensive weapon they have had, having been responsible for as many TDs as the rest of the team or offense combined, having 8 total scores to everyone else's 7, with the majority of his damage being his 7 receiving scores. Class of 2026 lineman Levi Grogan saw action on both sides of the football and will only be aided by better size and strength this coming season. Trevin Ward had 16 tackles as a sophomore and brings great size up front to the Skiers at 6'4", 245 pounds at that end and tackle position that could really turn up his junior season if he uses that reach effectively like he did to 2 sacks last season. Dylan Micah was a solid freshman, recording 5.6 yards per carry on just 30 carries and could be the primary tailback to replace Benson's presence in the backfield. I have also been informed that Liam Phelan and Rocco Garaffa are class of 2028 hopefuls heading into this season, trying to see some action. Or maybe that's class of 2027, and I just don't know how to count. But regardless, some incoming freshmen that are probably going to be seeing some varsity snaps. And after discussing with my guy Henry there, it seems that the Skiers are going to try and limit the turnovers through the air that killed them last year by running the ball more. And, they fared well against Basalt and Grand Valley in a scrimmage recently. And that doesn't mean everything, so let's take a look at the schedule for this fall 2023 season here that includes, games against Glenwood. I think that Glenwood's going to be pretty good this year, so I wouldn't give Aspen that. Gunnison was a playoff team in 1A last year and was kind of a breath of fresh air as far as like some of the upsets that they were able to pull off in what was like, I'd say, a pretty successful season for, this team. But they were also on the senior heavy side. So, I think that Aspen could potentially win this game. Meeker, they're just kind of a powerhouse, so I don't see that. They're not playing Battle Mountain. So, Battle Mountain's not going to have a varsity team this year, according to my sources. Once again, Steamboat Springs, this is a very interesting matchup. I think that this is going to be a pretty good football game, but I do think that, Aspen and Steamboat, it's a coin toss. That's what I should say when assessing these teams, is that it is a coin toss of a game. So more on Steamboat in the next episode, but I digress a little bit here. They then have Coleridge, Grand Valley. I think that these are both very winnable games, and you'll hear why in just a little bit here. Grand Valley, a little bit more difficult here, but I think that they should still go 2-0 here. I don't think that they beat Rifle, if I'm being 100% honest. just looking at who rifles returning on both sides of the football, and they're just returning a lot of scoring. So, that's going to make it pretty difficult. Then they have Moffat County here, who, will be losing some of their best players, maybe of all time, but will also bring back a ton of defense as well. And then Basalt, once again, graduating a ton of historic players, but returning a pretty solid defense. I think that at minimum, this team wins 2 games, and at most could win 4 to 5. So we'll say a window of wins for the Aspen Skiers of 2 to 5, just to be safe. But I do think that they're probably closer to the 4 and 5 overall record for this upcoming season. Now let's talk about the defending league champs here, the Basalt Longhorns, who, last year rolled through the regular season going undefeated, with their closest contest being a 14-point win over Moffat County, before eventually having to go on the road, and they would lose to the eventual state champs in Eaton. Now, this was a very decorated senior class here, especially on the offensive side of the ball. Cade Schneider at quarterback was solid his senior year, throwing for 1,080 yards and 15 scores, while almost completing 60% of his passes, and was a consistent presence these past few years that leaves questions under center for the first time in a minute. Cooper Crawford was the heartbeat of this offense with 1,489 yards and a team high and more than any other rushers combined 21 rushing touchdowns, and running for over 100 yards in every game outside of 2. Dylan Madden was third on the squad with 282 rushing yards, but was the team's leading receiver with a little under half of the total receptions at 40, which he turned into 483 yards and 7 scores, which was, fantastic. And then he was also very important on special teams, and that gave him over 1,000 all-purpose yards and led the team with 3 interceptions as well from the seniors. The guy sandwiched between Dylan and Cooper was senior tailback Trevin Beckman, who had 8 rushing scores and 623 yards in this backfield, making just those top 3 seniors responsible for basically 2,400 yards and 192 points, not accounting for PATs. Luke Rappaport was second on the team with 207 receiving yards, but his 5 receiving touchdowns will be difficult to replace since the other 4 receivers who caught a score only caught 1, and that makes for all receiving touchdowns gone across the stage this past spring. Side note, he also had an interception and 4 pass breakups as a defender. Ben Lemongini here was somebody who was important on the defensive side of the ball, making up for a few tackles for loss here, while also getting to the quarterback 2 times and forcing 2 fumbles, and doubled that in the recoveries department. Dylan matched Ben's efforts in recovering loose balls and broke up a team-high 8 passes. Jamie Dolan was a hog, being the only senior with over 50 tackles, and was second on the squad with 13 tackles for loss. And then Cooper Crawford was the only other senior with double-digit tackles for loss at 10, and sacking the quarterback 3 times, but joins a 2023 class that was responsible for 42 tackles for loss between the combined efforts of Dolan, Coop, Trevin, Rappaport, Lev Iluz, and Lemon Jelly here. Turnover-wise, the defense will be losing 56% to the diploma handoff. But luckily for the Longhorns, who look fairly depleted on offense, there are some studs on defense making a return, like rising junior Mav Dobronsky, who had 2 interceptions and was third on the team with 55 tackles and found himself wrapping up ball carriers in the backfield 4 times. Sophomore sensation William Daniel went ludicrous with a team-high 16 tackles for loss of his 65 total tackles and getting to the quarterback 3 times, while also receiving the credit of 7 additional hurries. Dylan Johnston was only a freshman and had 21 tackles, but was alert on the field with 2 fumble recoveries and has 3 more years of improvement to go. Paul Schenk was actually the best at getting to the quarterback with 4 sacks and a team-high 8 hurries that combined with his 11 tackles for loss and 25 total, making him a must-watch senior this upcoming season. And then leading tackler Noah Johnston notched 73 total tackles and was just head and shoulders above the leader in solo stops with 31, and 5 of those coming in the backfield. He may also be the quarterback with him being the only other player to throw a touchdown last season. And, you can tell that this offense is going to have to start over, but they have very important pieces on defense. So let's go ahead and talk about, what this upcoming season is going to look like here. So they open up against Summit. I do think that they just have more returning pieces than Summit, but I'll say that that's a toss-up before they definitely just obliterate Eagle Valley and Roaring Fork. Glenwood Springs, I think that this is a really important game for both these teams. I think that Glenwood Springs wants to win this one really bad and maybe should, but Basalt could definitely win this. Grand Valley, I think that that is a win for Basalt here. Rifle, I actually think Rifle is probably my current favorite to win this league this season, so I'm going to give Rifle the edge in this matchup. Moffat County, they should definitely win, and then they should close out the season with more wins against Coleridge and Aspen. So, I think that at worst, Basalt, if they lose to like Summit, Glenwood, and Rifle, that puts them at 6-3 this season. But I do think that there is a universe where they can even go 8-1. So, we'll say a window of wins of 6 to 8, even with all the moving pieces. And, I'm projecting probably a 7-2 record personally and a second place spot in this league. Now we're on to one of the programs that made very steady improvements last season and also has one of the best logos in all of Colorado football. That is the Coleridge Titans here, who finally snapped what I believe was a multiple season lose streak against Roaring Fork in week 2 and went on to, beat Olathe as well by a combined margin of 48 before starting to be on the wrong end of those scores. So let's go ahead and talk about the season and the seniors that were important to it. So Brandon Short put the team on his back this past season, rushing for over 1,000 yards and 9 touchdowns, while also throwing one and averaging over 110 yards per game last season. You also have senior passer Ryder Powell, who left a lot to be desired through the air, but ran for 539 yards and 4 scores to make for a respectable backfield out of Newcastle. And Ryder also caught 2 of the team's total 3 passing scores. Brandon was also a machine on the defensive side of the football with a pair of picks, pass deflections, and tackles for loss to go with his team's second best 77 total tackles and actually being the leader in solos. Jesus Comunes was a great use of space last season with a 250-plus pound frame and strength to match. He was tied for the team lead with fellow senior defensive lineman Angelo Perea with 5.5 tackles for loss, but had 35 total tackles to Perea's 18. Now, some of the guys that come back here are going to include the leading tackler Grayson Eisenhart, who had 84 tackles and forced a team-high 5 forced fumbles while also being tasked with being a guard or tackle at times and paving lanes for this solid run game. Sophomore Ethan Sanchez and Carter Kuhn both notched 2 interceptions that paced the entire team and were joined by Eisenhart, who had 1, but the former pair were responsible for a combined 77 tackles, and Carter was second on the team with 5 tackles for loss. Cameron Benke will resume nose guard duty after a junior season that saw him wrap up ball carriers behind the line of scrimmage 4.5 times. And the Knights will see 10 of their top 13 tacklers come back, and 4 of those are sophomore studs. And then Regan Powell appears to be poised to be the quarterback entering his junior year, but needs some serious work. Now, they have a lot of defenders come back, but the heart of this offense needs to be replaced, and that is a tall task. So looking ahead to this schedule, I don't think that they beat Steamboat. I think that they should still beat Roaring Fork, probably. Salida, a little bit of a toss-up. I don't think that they beat Aspen. There's a chance that they beat Grand Valley, just because Grand Valley really did, their Grand Valley, I should say, is going to be really young next year, is what I should say. They're going to be very young next year, but they arguably have more playmaking capability on the defensive side of the football. Then Basalt and Rifle, I don't think that they win either of those games. Now, those are the only games that they have scheduled at this time, which is 7. But let's assume that they play an Olathe and a Moffat County as well. I think that they go 1-1 in those games. So I think that honestly, they should still probably win at least one game this year. And then I'll say for the window of wins, I'll say on the high end of 3. So just a little bit of an improvement from last year, as far as what I had projected them to accomplish. But I think that they're going to be closer to the 1-8 or 2-7 side than the 3-6 side, personally. Now let's talk about the Cardinals out of Parachute, Colorado. And, in their first year in 2A, they balanced their schedule with 1A and 2A contests. And I think won the games they were supposed to, but were not competitive in games against teams that were above 500. And they have kind of a rough go here with leading ball carriers Jordan Cedino, Colton Clark, and Brendan Garcia all graduating after recording 568, 460, and 167 yards on the ground respectively, and a combined 8 touchdowns. Cade Sackett was the only receiver with double-digit receptions, notching 13 of them for a pair of scores. Big name here, Jacob Doyle was the beast that he was his junior year, leading the team in pancake blocks on the offensive line, and then he was the leading tackler with 91 total tackles and 6 of those landing ball carriers on their back before crossing the line of scrimmage, and a team-high 3 forced fumbles. Colton Clark was a do-it-all kind of dude with an interception, a pair of forced fumbles, and fumble recoveries, and was even the leader in solo tackles at 44 out of his 83 on his lonesome, while also pacing the teams in sacks and tackles for loss with 5 and 7 respectively. Jeremy Rugard's production will be insane to replace, considering he made up for half the team's interceptions with 5. And then Brendan Garcia was amongst the leading tacklers on this team with 5 tackles for loss and 44 in total, with Cedino being a top 3 tackler with 58 and 2 for loss. So a lot of the same names here. You'll start to notice that on these 2A levels, especially guys that are playing both ways quite often and having a big impact on both here. So yeah, that's what they're losing. That's what's walking out the door. Lots of defensive playmaking. Now, the big returner will be Mason Shopner, who was tied for 3rd best at 5 tackles for loss and was the leading tackler amongst non-seniors and pass rusher with 4 sacks, 11 hurries, 57 tackles, and a partridge in a pear tree, leading the team with 3 fumble recoveries, though he will be asked to force more since 7 of the 9 forced fumbles graduate. Braden Allen will be a senior this fall after reaching 40 tackles his junior season. Sion Clegg made a name for himself his freshman year with 5 tackles for loss. Scotty Vines was very close to leading the team in yards with less receptions and even led the squad with 3 receiving touchdowns. And sophomore Andrew Horner was asked to be the primary passer and did so with varying efficiency, and his rushing scores and passing scores tying for the amount of interceptions he threw at 7. So he has to protect the football a little bit better heading into this fall season here, where they have the likes currently of Ellicott, Cedar Ridge, North Fork, Manual, Basalt, Aspen, Coleridge, Rifle, Moffat County. They definitely should beat Ellicott. Cedar Ridge, I'm not so sure if they're going to beat them again this year. And then I think that it just kind of gets more and more rough. North Fork, Manual's going to be really good this year. Basalt's going to be good. Aspen, they're just I feel like returning a lot more players from last year, so their cohesion should probably help them beat Grand Valley here. I think that they should beat Coleridge, and then I don't know if they beat Rifle or Moffat. So, let's say best case scenario, they beat Ellicott, Cedar Ridge, Aspen, and Coleridge, making their ceiling 4 wins, but I think that they could win as low as 2. So I'm going to say a window of wins of 2 to 4 for this Cardinals team here. Now, I think it's time that we talk about my personal favorite to win league this year, finally getting their feet under them after a pretty rough go at it just a couple seasons ago. But, I think that the Rifle Bears here should be back to their very competitive ways. And I mean, they arguably were this last season. With a very competitive schedule, they gave playoff teams a tough time. They beat Montezuma Cortez early in the season. They, only lost to Moffat County by 3. And, Rifle punched themselves a ticket to the playoffs where they pulled off a huge upset, beating Florence 14-7 before losing the rematch to Montezuma Cortez 14-0. But there are a lot of things to be happy about this season, and there's a lot to look forward to, in my opinion, for the Bears. Now, before I talk about the players that will be making plays this fall, let's go ahead and talk about some of the guys that helped them secure this 6-5 record here. Nicholas Saldivar was the primary back, recording 178 carries for 898 yards, taking the brunt of the damage to establish this Bears rushing attack and finding pay dirt 5 times in doing so. He also caught 2 touchdowns as well, so a multifaceted, multi-talented back, going to be a little bit on the tougher side to replace. Up front, Rifle will be without Cade Stree and Giovanni Gonzalez, who both notched over 70 tackles and disrupted opposing offenses while getting hurries and swallowing up ball carriers. And then Preston Bird had over 50 tackles and was the last senior to do so on their tackling list. But there are some playmakers returning specifically on the offensive side of the ball, such as Isaac Valencia, who I think is going to take more handoffs his junior year after receiving 47 carries as a sophomore and doing the most with 240 yards and 2 scores off of that. Not sure if it's related, but I will assume that Joel Valencia here is going to be back in the fold, and I think that is Isaac's older sibling, and was a consistent athlete last year, catching 4 touchdowns on just 11 receptions for a team best 210 yards. I think that when you have a receiver that can play make like that, that opens up the possibility to throw the ball a little bit more than you typically would in this season. So that's very promising. They're going to be able to get Joel the ball in space, whether it's screens or shallow crossings and stuff like that. And I think that is going to set up this Rifle team for a lot of success. But the majority of the offensive burden falls on the same guy it did last year, Logan Gross, who ran for 901 yards and 11 touchdowns, bringing his total offensive scoring load to 20 with another 9 passing scores and 795 yards. I think that obviously rushing for 900 and throwing for basically 800, that makes this, upcoming season for him a very high chance of maybe being 1,000 kind of guy, which is super exciting and, just tantalizing, honestly, to imagine, evaluating this prospect. And hopefully, we'll look at the schedule here in a little bit, but hopefully I can get out west and see them play, whether it's a away game that they play or something to that end that's a little bit closer to like the 285 side of the west side for me. Now, Sterling Cook was the security blanket, having twice as many receptions as the next guy for 232 yards there. So there's that, with just a ton of receptions, just not scoring as much. Then 6'2", 190-pound Marcus Washington could be a matchup problem like he was last year, catching 10 passes for 110 yards and a pair of scores if he isn't needed more as a potential tackler/blocker here. Potential tackle, Now, Parker Miller was the most decorated tackler on this team with 78 total takedowns and makes up a group that returns 10 of their top 14 tacklers from last year, along with fellow seniors Jesus Martinez, Troy Matea, Efren Bustillos, and others. Jesus with 71, Troy with 39, and Efren with 36. Troy here was also tied with Gabe McGregor in total forced fumbles at 3 apiece. And then Efren and Gabe both notched a pair of sacks last season, but would love to convert those 22 combined pressures into takedowns. So there's a lot of potential to just give quarterbacks headaches this season. And that, on top of all the TFLs that they have, just showed that this front seven has a lot of opportunities to really cook. And then, they have a guy in the back end that can capitalize off of that with Sterling Cook, who had 4 picks for 105 return yards last season. And Logan Gross as well, who is another junior who had multiple INTs. So let's look at the schedule for this upcoming season that opens up with a doozy here, as their very first matchup will be against Montezuma Cortez in another rematch here. Obviously, they won this exact placed game last year, but they're going to have some extra fuel following that postseason loss. That should be a good one, and maybe even a little 2-year rivalry that they'll get going here. They then have Glenwood Springs. I think they should win that game, followed by Delta, who obviously came in second over the course of the entire season last year, as the runner-up. They're going to have some good players here, so I don't want to call it a win for Rifle, but it should be a competitive game. I think that they beat Brush. I think that they beat Moffat County. Moffat County, they lost to them last year by just 3, so they should be able to flip the script on them. Basalt was another team that they didn't quite beat last year, but I think just have more returning talent than this year. And then Aspen, Grand Valley, and Coal Ridge to close, and I think that they get a 3-game sweep there. So I think that games that they for sure definitively win is probably 6. And then I'd say on the high end, actually, okay, let me think about this. I'm going to say a window of wins of 5-7. I think that's fair. I think that kind of reflects where they were last year and the strides that they should take forward with the team that they currently have. And the record that I want to say that they have with 5-7, I want to say that they're more on the 7-2 side. I think that the only games that they could possibly lose are to Delta or Montezuma Cortez, and then, a combination of Glenwood, Moffat, or Basalt. So actually, I'm going to say 5-8. 5-8 window of wins, and I'm leaning 7-2 for the Rifle Bears coming up this season. And the last team on this, season preview, this episode specifically, is going to be Moffat County, who, last year they went 7-3. They went 7-2 in the regular season, only losing to Basalt and Res Christian, but they had some really close games against like Bayfield. That was kind of a weird one. Or, I'd say that their game against Steamboat Springs was also probably a little too close in my opinion, and they lost to the Classical Academy in the playoffs in the first round. But, it was mostly competitive, but I will say that the graduating seniors are going to hurt this year a little bit because Evan Atkin was, his run as one of the best Bulldogs on the gridiron comes to an end after rushing for 50 scores over his career, being a multiple-time Playmaker of the Week guy, being an award candidate guy, being in consideration for all Playmaker multiple times. He had 1,100 rushing yards and 391 receiving yards this year, which was more than the next 3 guys combined. And that's not to say that other 23 guys like Caden Hickson aren't important, since he found the end zone 4 times on the ground and ran for 327 yards while catching another 292. And with his 350 return yards, he was just shy of a 1K season. Court Murphy was the projected starter under center and passed 2 scores and ran for another 5 before it appears he missed some time due to injury, but nonetheless was a stabilizing force for this Craig squad. Max Noland was second on the team with 3 receiving touchdowns and just broke over 100 yards. Moving on the defensive side, Court Murphy had 82 tackles and stood alone at total tackles, leading the squad. Michael Voloshin was not as plentiful in total tackles at 65, but was a game wrecker with 11.5 tackles for loss and a team-high 5 sacks. Team highs also included Johnny Lopez's 6 interceptions, which was just under half of the team total at 13. And then other seniors who had interceptions was Max Noland, and that pair pushed this Bulldogs team to be without over 50% of their total picks from last year. And then Garrett Anson and Atkin both had a triple in the TFL category. So why do I still speak so highly of this team that's losing arguably 4 of their best players? Well, it's because some of the guys that are coming back are still solid dogs here, like Aaron Aguilar and Ethan Schaff, who bring back 95 total tackles and 9.5 for loss, along with 6 sacks to the class of 2024 this fall. You also had sophomore contributors like Zach Hedman and Caden Vanderslice, who had 3.5 tackles for loss, with the former also reaching over the 50 tackle mark. Aaron, Evan Beaver, Hudson Jones, and Bryant Carlson all bring back interceptions to the defense, with Bryant being the leader of this group at 2, and the overall interception return yards maestro of last year. So, having a guy that not only can get interceptions, but make plays off of them is going to be critical for this defense that is just returning so many pieces here. Aguilar's name pops back up when thinking about who will be the primary ball carrier next season, since he was second on the team with 59 carries, but he just struggled finding the end zone, only scoring once here. So we'll see how he is as a red zone option. Hudson Jones will be leaned on in the pass game after the big, only non-senior here had 200 yards, or even more than 100 yards for that matter, and scoring twice. And then Evan Beaver, played the role of a more complimentary quarterback and played it well with 880 passing yards and throwing 7 scores to just 3 picks. But without a legendary school tailback to catch and rush, he will have so much more to do for this team, and he will be relied on for so much more as well. So I think that's important when we start to look at the Moffat County schedule, starting off on the road against Steamboat before playing Bayfield and Rawlins, which is a team from Wyoming, at home. And then Rifle, Basalt, and Aspen, all 3 road games scheduled in there, and then Grand Valley. So currently, as it stands, this team only has 7 scheduled games. If we were to base it off of last season where they scheduled Res Christian and Cole Ridge, I'm assuming the Cole Ridge one has to happen here for league. That that bodes well for them to face Cole Ridge. I think that they should be able to beat a team like Cole Ridge for a win. If they schedule another 3A team, I don't know the odds of them being able to beat a team like Res Christian again. But, Steamboat Springs, I think, is also going to be a way tougher out this year. So that one is more of a coin toss, especially because we'll see if Moffat will be able to control the play clock kind of the way that they wanted to last season. Bayfield is going to be better, but I still don't think that they're great. So I'm going to give this one to Moffat here. Rawlins, Wyoming, this team, it was one that I don't want to say put it to last year, but a team that they were successful against, and Rawlins themselves were not very good. So I'll give the edge to homeboys here in Craig, Colorado. I don't think that they beat Rifle. I think that Basalt is an interesting one. I think that this is actually a pretty competitive game. Basalt, I think, has the better defense, but, I think that obviously returning a quarterback is going to be a big deal. And then Aspen is once again a toss-up here. And then I think that they do beat Grand Valley if I'm being 100%. So, I think that this window of wins is kind of tricky. There are only like 2 or 3 teams that they probably won't beat, depending on who they schedule, of course, right? So I think that at worst, they probably win 5 games, and then I'll say on the high end, they win 8 and 7. I say that this is a 5-7 team. I think that they end up just dropping a couple anyway, and I'm kind of leaning more towards an overall record of 6-3 for the Moffat County Bulldogs this season. So that does it for this set of previews that included Mountain View, Northridge, Thompson Valley, Roosevelt, concluding my 3A previews, Aspen, Basalt, Cole Ridge, Grand Valley, Rifle, and Moffat County to begin my 2A previews. And, Wednesday I will wrap up 2A, and then Friday I will have some of the best 1A teams around to talk about. So I'm very excited for all of those. And then y'all are back in action in season previews with Gideon and Coach V. Coach V obviously covering the majority of Southern Colorado, Gideon picking up a lot of the weight in Northern Colorado, as well as a few other teams here and there. So be sure to stay tuned to our podcast for that, whether that's turning on notifications for Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Google Podcasts for whenever we release a new episode, or if that's following us on social media, Tik Tok, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, where we post the episode covers and, announce when they are being released. And then, or YouTube, subscribing to us there and getting notifications whenever we upload to there. But that will do it for this episode of previews. I have been your host, Cody Stauffer, and peace.